also Palestinian prisoners were able to, get back home because there's thousands of Palestinian prisoners being held by the Israeli government. So what we did is we tried to get members of Congress to issue individual statements or collective statements calling for a ceasefire. We got about 100 or so, and President Biden in May then switched U.S. policy and said, it's time for the day after to begin. It's time for a ceasefire. So we thought that was really important that we should, collectively we're able to shift the way the United States was approaching. Obviously not enough because we still don't have a ceasefire. And what we learned is that, now that we've got the admin in a better place where everyone collectively understands that this is the moment, we needed to use more leverage. That was part of the issue, is that the United States was saying one thing, but then green lighting all these weapons. And we, at FCNL, we've been saying since the start of this and long before this, and Quakers have been saying this a lot longer than FCNL, is that, there really aren't military, quote unquote, solutions to these issues, only diplomatic ones that get at the root causes of violence. And if we just keep sending more and more bombs, it disincentivizes the actors from actually trying to agree to a deal, which is what we need. So we got a lot of work to do, and the children at the Ramallah Friends School, this was the #1 thing they asked, is that, why is the U.S. continuing to send military aid to an Israeli government that they see as perpetuating a genocide in Gaza with U.S. bombs, with U.S. military assistance? And one story that really kind of hit home was through tears, this 3rd grade Ramallah Friends School student who he's the 3rd grade cousin of Hisham, the Ramallah Friends grad, who remains paralyzed to this day after a hate crime in Vermont. And he got up at one of the assemblies and he cried in front of his whole class and said, "Can you tell people in the United States to stop supporting crimes of hate against Palestinians?" And his teacher gave him a big hug, and everybody was really choked up by that. And every night while I was staying at the Ramallah Friends School, I was hearing sounds of gunfights and warplanes flying overhead that peppered almost every single night while I was in Ramallah. And while we were there, the Senate actually last January voted on a resolution called it's invoking Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. Around the office, we got to keep things a little bit light so we don't go insane, so we call it 502BB. And this would require that the State Department issue a report on human rights violations going on, both in Gaza and the West Bank. And, that only received 12 votes, 11 votes, and then 1 public statement from Senator Schatz. But, for us, that was actually a huge deal. We finally broke the ice and forced a vote in Congress that centered human rights for Palestinians. We've never seen that before. And so we did our best to try to explain why this was forward progress, this was forward momentum, and it opened up the door to more congressional action, which we know is needed. And one 8th grade student actually approached us after the assembly and said, well, that's 12 more senators than I thought who support Palestinian human rights. And so I thought that was actually powerful and goes to show that when we force votes and get people on the record, that's a very important thing, and it can reverberate even across the world, and that's something that everybody was paying attention to. And the ICJ, court case was being filed at that same time too. So these things, being on the ground, you kind of felt how they impact the conversation. And so in November, just a couple months ago, less than a year after that 502B resolution got a vote, Congress actually held its first ever vote to block offensive weapon sales to Israel, and senators voted on 3 joint resolutions of disapproval. Thumbs up if you know what I'm talking about. Couple of votes. Okay, great, yeah. So yeah, historic vote. And these are called JRDs, or joint resolutions of disapproval. Again, if anything I'm saying is just completely, you don't know what I'm saying, this is what we call a jargon giraffe at FCNL. So you throw one of those up and I'll try to explain. If I'm getting in the weeds of alphabet soup, you let me know. Jargon giraffe. So that resolution didn't pass, but 19 senators voted in favor. So we went from 11 to 19 and really 20 if you add up collectively all the senators that voted for the 3 resolutions. So that to us was a significant piece, is significant momentum, and we are really grateful to Senator Van Hollen, one of our leaders on this issue. He's been, you know, working very hard, and we appreciate his staff. He was one of the yes votes on that. It's also, I will say that it's not just that the vote happened, we got 19, but it matters who voted for this. Senator Shaheen was one of our yes votes, and she is now the leading Democrat in the Foreign Relations Committee. So we're entering this new territory where it's a mainstream position to challenge weapon sales to Israel. A lot of these folks had worked with FCNL to block weapon sales to Saudi on some of their human rights violations. So what we're trying to do is say, let's not have any exceptions for any country. Let's hold everybody to that same standard of US law, international law, human rights policy. And we're so grateful. We also got Ossoff from Georgia, Warnock, Durbin, the #2 Democrat voted for it. Senator Kaine, our dear friend from Virginia, Senator Murphy, who's at the time, the chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee in Senate Foreign Relations. So I just say this to say that things are changing. Again, we're getting more and more people calling for a ceasefire. More people are saying unconditional weapons sales to the Israeli government. You know, we need to kind of look forward and look beyond that to see what we can do and what kind of leverage we can have to really advance U.S. policy. We're going to maybe get to questions. Oh, yeah. Yes, and he voted yes for it. So I wanted to unpack why I think this was so important and gives us kind of, you know, gives us a way forward of where we need to go from here, in my opinion. And a lot of people disagree with my opinion, so that's fine. But let's wait till the Q&A. So advocates for this Israel JRD, you know, we're fully aware that ending unconditional support for Israel is not going to be easy. This is going to be a long and challenging process. There's decades of history here. And, you know, it's a very volatile situation. But we've shown on other contexts how forcing votes and debates, even if you don't pass the bill, can, one, change U.S. policy and advance diplomacy. So I think that's really important to understand. And that's one of the opportunities is, you know, we don't necessarily need to pass the bill for it to have a major impact and save lives. A clear example for us was seeing this major shift, you know, in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. From 2015 to 2021, the United States provided military support to the Saudi government. And you know, that was a horrific civil war, but we saw that there were several JRD votes on Saudi Arabia from 2016 all the way to 2019. And we went from 27 votes to 47 votes. Then we got 56 votes in 2018. So we steadily grew more support over time. And Trump, even though we didn't officially pass that Yemen War Powers resolution in 2018, he ended in-flight refueling for Saudi bombings of Yemen. And we also saw the agreement of the Hodeidah ceasefire, which opened up a ton of aid access and probably saved about 250,000 people's lives. Senator Van Hollen was one of the co-sponsors on that bill. Senator Cardin voted for that as well. And so I kind of hold on to that to kind of explain why that JRD vote, despite, you know, us getting only 19, it's really important. You know, we want to keep building on that. So, and I'll also remind you, that was under a Trump administration. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward, you know, after the inauguration, the next 4 years, that we can create these wedge issues that can still move policy and even move a Trump administration. So there's lots to work on. I'm just going to share a few more stories here, and then we can maybe open it up for some Q&A. So on my last day of the trip, how many people here know what UNRWA is? Okay. John, everyone's so smart here. So on my last day of the trip, I actually caught a shuttle. They said the UNRWA staff, they brought me to their facility in Jerusalem, And I jumped in their bus and they took me all the way to my uncle's house in Jordan. And I gotta stop in Jordan because my aunt cooks the best mensef in the world, and I just have to eat it. So during the ride, an UNRWA employee named Nisreen actually told us about her work in off hours to evacuate Gazan children in critical condition for emergency medical treatment. She showed us pictures of severe burns, children with amputated limbs, and this is really some of the most disturbing images that I've ever seen, in part because it wasn't, Nisreen showed it to me. This is someone that she knew. These were children that she knew personally. And in total, she's actually been able to evacuate 50 children, getting them safe passage into Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, Jordan, Oman, and elsewhere, all accompanied by a +1 adult and their children. Unfortunately, a lot of these medical evacuations have stopped because a lot of these crossings are closed, including the Rafah crossing. But despite her being able to secure medical evacuation to a hospital in the United States in Florida, she explained that many of the families that she was trying to convince to come to the United States actually refused to come because they were afraid of the United States. They were afraid of how they were going to be treated. She said, "We tell them that there are good doctors and medical facilities, but they're too scared to go to the US." I praised Nisreen for her work, and she replied that I'm just doing it to not surrender to the fact that there is no justice. Less than a week after we got back to the US, 12 individuals of the 13,000 UNRWA staff in Gaza and the 30,000 staff across the region in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, East Jerusalem, West Bank, they were accused of taking part in the October 7 attack. And despite UNRWA firing the individuals, opening up an independent investigation, the United States has cut off all funding to the agency. And so without these funds, Nisreen and other UNRWA staff really are not going to be able to serve Palestinians. And UNRWA is the backbone of aid delivery in Gaza. They provide all the essential resources. And in fact, they house a lot of what other humanitarians are doing is facilitated by UNRWA. So Oxfam staff, Save the Children staff, CARE, other UN agencies, WHO, all of these groups. Yeah, exactly. They all rely on UNRWA's facilities. So FCNL, we've been working very hard to try to restore this funding. We know it's going to be a tough road to hoe, but we're used to it. And what we're trying to do is support the reintroduction of the UNRWA Funding Emergency Restoration Act. And this was introduced last session by Carson, Jayapal, and Chikowski, hoping to get another member, well, hoping to get a few more. But we had a strong introduction, about 70 members of Congress co-sponsored upon introduction. We also had a nice Senate companion. Van Hollen was on that bill, led by Welch. And it's pretty simple. It just says we need to remove any limitations on UNRWA funding so they can continue to do their important work. And I'll say that after that independent investigation and other new facts came to light, virtually every country that had initially suspended funding, like Canada, France, Germany, Australia, Japan, and others, they've all restored funding. So the United States were the last country that has not restored that funding. So we're trying to get the United States to join that group. And if folks want to participate with us on this, we've set up a lot of resources on the FCNL site. We think getting a strong introduction and making sure that the appropriations process, which, as you may know, the government is being held together with bubblegum and duct tape right now. So March 15th is when we're going to have a new appropriations bill that's going to go to September. So that the rest of the year, they're hoping to fund that. We're trying to make sure that UNRWA is not restricted in that bill. We're trying to do everything we can to work on appropriators. So getting a lot of support, including Senator Also Brooks. I think she's a key target for our work. Exactly. Thank you. So that's one more. So with that, I wanted to share one last story, and there is hope for the way forward and a just and lasting peace. I feel that in my bones. I really do. Um, we don't know the timing, obviously, but I really think that we have a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of momentum going for us. And while we were in the Ramallah, while I was in Ramallah, I spent many hours with the Carter Center's Israel-Palestine team, and someone mentioned Jimmy Carter, and what a loss to the human rights community. I was fortunate to actually get an invite to the state funeral this past week, and was in the room, heard so many incredible stories about his work, and also from the Carter Center staff, how much he had really done on this. And right now, their team in the West Bank is doing incredible behind the scenes work, trying to bring together Palestinian civil society. I was blown away by how much work is actually being done to try to unite Palestinians on the ground, and how much Carter, his legacy is really contributing to that work. So I was introduced to ISEP, Institute for Social and Economic Progress. They've been doing a series of polling on, well, what do Palestinians think about the war? And I was really shocked by what they found, and it challenged many of the assumptions that we hear a lot about what is possible, quote unquote. There's no partner for peace. They support Hamas. They don't support Israel's right to exist. But I thought this data was actually very telling. They found that a majority wanted elections immediately. They want a reformed PA, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and they want a secular democracy with freedom of religion. Support for a two-state solution jumped up significantly. It's now around 70%. That's almost a 40% jump since before October 7. And it dawned on me how aligned in a lot of ways that U.S. and Palestinian interests are right now. If you put aside, all the BS, that there is a lot there, that the United States wants a two-state solution. The United States, would like to see a more open and free Palestinian society. And that's actually what Palestinians seems to want, according to this polling. Also, if there were an election today, Marwan Barghouti, the imprisoned Fatah-aligned Intifada leader, would beat any Hamas leader with over 70% of the vote. And we're not hearing that on CNN, unfortunately. Many have referred to him as the Palestine Nelson Mandela, but unfortunately, he's experiencing massive amounts of torture in Israeli prisons as we speak. And I got a chance to actually meet his wife, Fadwa Barghouti, and we've been doing some work with the family to try to get more people to understand about the plight of Palestinian prisoners. And she told me, she said, she's renewing her international campaign to secure his release and the release of all Palestinian political prisoners. And she told me, as a wife, I'd miss him if he were released to Gaza, but as a Palestinian, I support it. And they've been separated for decades at this point. So for her to say that to me was very powerful. In addition to the devastating toll the war in Gaza has taken on Palestinian civil society, it was clear from our conversations with Israeli society, who is still to this day, a year later from this trip, still reeling from the atrocious massacre of October 7, and anxiously hoping for the return of their loved ones. More than 100 individuals are still being held hostage. And unfortunately, in many ways, the United States government is amplifying the voices from, like some of the harder line right-wing segments of Israeli society and the government, while failing to emphasize the voice of a mass segment of the Israeli population calling for an immediate agreement, including a ceasefire that would promise the release of all hostages. And currently, this is a really promising statistic for me, is that over 70% of Israelis now are pushing their government for an immediate ceasefire. So there's lots of space here that wasn't there before. And I think people are ready for the day after, quote unquote, to begin. So we know we have a lot of work to do. The international community, including the United States, people, American citizens across this country, we have to seriously invest in immediate negotiations to end the war, a long-term solution, inclusive and a comprehensive peace process. We know that there is no military solution, and rather than greenlighting more weapons, we want policymakers to provide humanitarian access and the cover for diplomacy. Because we know that a permanent ceasefire is going to protect Gaza, including 1 million children. A permanent ceasefire is going to help aid workers alleviate the humanitarian crisis. A permanent ceasefire is going to get all the hostages home. A permanent ceasefire is going to help us prevent this wider escalating regional war in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, possibly Iran, and elsewhere. And a permanent ceasefire, we need to actually stop the rampant spread of hate in really all its forms, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian racism. And so often you're hearing about the day after, and that's omitting key pieces of the puzzle, which includes Palestinian perspectives and dreams for their own future. And we know that the challenges ahead are immense, with the Trump administration in office saying, quote unquote, finish the job. We know that, there's lots of money in politics. We have essentially a quadfecta of Republicans controlling all these chambers, and they have done very little to this date, advocating for human rights, advocating for diplomacy. But I think our job is pretty clear. We need to expand the number of members calling for a ceasefire, try to restore humanitarian access, and make sure that U.S. weapons simply are not being used to violate international humanitarian law, whether or not it's in Israel-Palestine, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's anywhere in the world. And I think we have to hold true to those standards. So, and we know that our work is going to be challenging. So I will say just a moment, self-care is so important in this. I've been grinding away with FCNL and our colleagues and so many folks in the Quaker community around the country on this issue, and really so many other partners. And I wanted to share one last story about a trip I took to Barcelona to kind of unwind in August. I just had to get out. So I went to Barcelona. How many people have been to the Sagrada Familia? It's incredible. Gaudi is just an incredible architect. And I was in the church. I went into the catacombs area where Gaudi was buried, and I learned his story. I actually really didn't know. And I'm sitting in there trying to unwind from all this really intense activism. And I heard that, he spent 42 years of his life building the foundation of this incredible, house of worship. And he tragically was hit by a streetcar, died, but had built 25% of the church while he was there. While he was alive. And yet they continued the project for 100 years after his death. And they're still not done. They say they're going to be done in 2026. A lot of people in Barcelona said that is also BS. That they don't believe that they're going to finish it. But it looks very impressive. And I started weeping when I heard that story. It got me thinking about our work supporting human rights in Palestine, but really across the world as people of faith. And that we know that our work's not done and probably will not be done in our lifetime, but we're doing it because we love Palestinian children and really all children that aren't even born yet. And I want to keep that work going. We would love to work with you this year. So FCNL's advocacy teams are focused on Gaza this year. Our campaign is called Aid, Not Bombs. We're trying to restore UNRWA funding, and we are trying to limit the use, limit U.S. weapons to the government of Israel all year. So we would absolutely love. We do a monthly call. I'm assuming folks here might already know about the advocacy teams, but if you do have a special interest on this particular issue, this is a perfect year to get involved. And we really hope to work with you. So with that, I can end my remarks, and if folks still want to ask questions, please.
Thank you very much, Hassan. So I'll be happy to call on folks. Tracy Booth.
Good day, folks. I want to follow up on Hassan's invitation for advocacy group. We have a year now experience with the Sandy Spring advocacy team. We are based at Friend's House, but we would love to have lots more people involved in Sandy Spring meeting. to be part of our efforts. We have made several visits to our congressional representatives as recently as November for the national meeting of FCNL. There were 10 Maryland folk that went to the office of Van Hollen and Jamie Raskin, both of whom are extremely invested in this issue and are with us all the way and have stood up and said important things and voted and initiated legislation. So we have everything going for us. We're meeting on Monday night on a Zoom call, and anybody who wanted to be part of that call should speak to me, and I'll get your email on that list. But the FCNL infrastructure has been vital to what we're doing, and we are happy to be a small part of how many. There are something like 48 advocacy groups, more than 1,500 people across the country in almost every state but two. If you know anybody in Mississippi, or if you know anybody in South Dakota.
Yeah, that's right.
Those are the holdouts for the advocacy team. So all of it to the good. We are trying to do our best. We did a lot of postcard writing a month ago for the ceasefire, and we're going to keep going with that. And I'm very delighted that John and Richard are part of the Friends House community, but are part of this community and will be the bridge for us to work together and to be effective from this part of the world.
Thank you.
I have one question. Is Jamie, you mentioned 70 House members are supporting funding of UNRWA. Is Jamie Raskin one of the sponsors? And another question or statement, the Sandy Spring Friends meeting gave $1,000 to UNRWA recently. The other question I have is, which you hadn't mentioned, the Israeli legislature has forbidden UNRWA to be on any Israeli territory. So how can it function if they're going to enforce that?
So Raskin, yes, he's on board. As far as the Knesset law, I realized that I was like, there's so much to share. I cannot possibly explain every single detail, but that's an important one. And thank you for reminding me to bring it up. So in October, the Israeli Knesset passed a bill to prevent Israeli officials from interacting with UNRWA, and prevented, or saying that they're going to ban UNRWA from operating in the territory. So major obstacle, and it's really disincentivized. Actually, after that, Sweden has said that they're going to suspend their funding. They had initially turned it back on, and in December, they turned it back off. So major issue there. That said, I've been in touch with UNRWA staff, and they say that they're not sure what is going to happen. So folks may have remembered groups like Al-Haq, DCIP Palestine were put on the terror list, the 6 NGOs, and no one was arrested, and they're still all operating in the West Bank. So unless those UNRWA facilities are literally bombed and destroyed, that we think that UNRWA is going to continue to be able to operate. And there might be some workarounds where the EU can get funding to UNRWA still, where you've got other UN trucks going to UNRWA facilities right now, and then UNRWA is then distributing the funding. We'll also say that UNRWA is operating in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. So this is a larger issue that is going to be very important, regardless of what happens in Gaza. So we're remaining committed to UNRWA funding. It's a 7+ decade old institution, and it matters not just for aid delivery, but other services, and also the final status of refugee for Palestinians, because they've been advocating that Palestinians, in fact, are still refugees. So maintaining support for UNRWA is really critical for that as well. So lots of problems, but we're gonna try to handle it. Got it.
I have a question about the two-state solution that FCNL is advocating. and you say Palestinians mostly are advocating. And at Friends General Conference this summer, our keynote speaker talked about beyond the two-state solution, and he wrote a book about it that was distributed. So I'd like your reflections on that.
Yeah. So right now, FCNL, while we haven't abandoned the quote unquote two-state solution, that's not the center of our advocacy. What we're trying to push for is a situation where there's equality, human rights, dignity, and self-determination. So that's the framework in which we operate. Now, I thought that was just an interesting statistic where the shift of Palestinian civil society, I'm not necessarily saying that like that's going to be a new focus for our advocacy, but to dig into the meat of your question, going to the West Bank, you see that a two-state solution is going to be very hard when there's settlers and outposts literally on almost every hill you see driving across the West Bank. So that's going to make it very difficult to actually see some sort of two-state solution. But I think we need to create space for diplomacy, regardless of what this end state goal is, by trying to get the United States to pull back on our military aid, restoring humanitarian access, and creating the fertile ground for peace and diplomacy.
Thank you. Speaking of diplomacy, what is your sense of Marco Rubio if he becomes Secretary of State in continuing the diplomacy that we've had under the Biden administration? Even though the diplomacy hasn't worked so far, but
yeah, to me, we might be surprised at how little changes with regard to U.S. policy in this situation. And that's actually really tragic and unfortunate. It does seem like in recent weeks there has been more momentum for a ceasefire deal. There's a deal on the table to get 40 hostages home, and high-level Israeli officials have been involved, including Netanyahu. So hopefully we see some progress on that. Now, there's some other things I think people need to understand about what people are kind of planning, not just for the hostage deal and the ceasefire, but for the day after, is that, there's kind of a discussion going on whether or not it's going to be a Palestinian committee, that sort of a committee of technocrats that help run and facilitate what's happening in Gaza. There's another plan on the table for defense contractors to kind of take over humanitarian delivery. That's called the General's Plan. So that's a deal on the table. And we also have another option that people have been floating around, where the United Arab Emirates actually take over Gaza and it becomes a protectorate of the UAE as we move to hopefully a more stable situation where there's more Palestinian sovereignty. I don't know what's going to take hold in the next year if we do, and if we are lucky enough to see a ceasefire deal. But that's what we're watching for. And I think, unfortunately, without enough pressure from Congress, we might see it go into a direction that doesn't really serve Palestinian human rights or self-determination. And one of our big goals this year is to try to break through with at least some Republicans. We have, that is just our mandate. I think FCNL is in a good position to do that. Working with some anti-war Republican allies like Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, and others, looking at the Freedom Caucus, seeing what's possible. But that's going to be so critical for really influencing a Rubio.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. My interest and concern is the movement that is possible within Israel. In other words, the political situation seems like that's a central cog that's blocking everything. We have, I'm talking about FCNL and Quakers in our approach, have priorities and wishes and hopes pretty much in line. But the thing that seems to be a major blockage is the Israeli side. And I'm just wondering what kind of flexibility, leeway, possibility there is. Because without that solution, without that peace, in other words, the political situation now is governed in Israel, is governed by hardliners and people that will not give an inch. But what is the likelihood and hope and possibility for things to change in Israel? Because once things start changing there, then there's a lot of possibility of openness to work out these other solutions. That's a major block that seemed like UNRWA and humanitarian aid and ceasefire and all that stuff. As long as the present regime in Israel is in place and has a hard and fast lock on all the decisions, that's going to be a blockage that's going to be hard to overcome. So what I'm asking about is, what is the likelihood that things will change within Israel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I got the question. So, well, I think we have to recognize that things already have changed in Israel, where you have 71+% of the population pressing their government for an immediate ceasefire. You've got, major military leaders, Yoav Gallant and others that are saying that, there's nothing more to accomplish militarily in Gaza. So that, we are seeing these shifts, right? U.S. policy hasn't caught up with that. We say we're supporting Israel, but when we're supporting Israel, shouldn't that include what the majority of the population now want? I'll also say, to me, another big question is the forces lobbying Congress inside the United States, groups like AIPAC, CUFI, PMFI, and really a myriad of other groups that are really, spending a lot of money on election campaigns right now. There's $100 million spent in this past election cycle, and unfortunately, we lost some really pro peace members like Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush and others. So, I totally get your point. I think shifting public opinion inside the United States with U.S. lawmakers is a way to kind of create more space for those peace advocates inside of Israel who can point to say, well, see, we're becoming more and more isolated. Look at that vote that happened, this JRD vote, or look at these ICJ or ICC rulings. Like, that's not where we want our government to be positioned. And all of that international pressure, I think, will contribute in a positive way to the peace movement in Israel. I'll also say the reason why I'm going to the region in February is because I was invited by Combatants for Peace. These are Israeli and Palestinian veterans. So I'm hoping to have an even more comprehensive answer for you when I get back.
Hassan, isn't it also true that within Israel itself, most people don't know what's going on in Gaza? That most media doesn't really give very detailed coverage.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And on that last trip, I spoke with the executive director for this legal group called Hamoked, and the head attorney there was telling us that just by the nature of the fact that we are Americans and we have we've been exposed to way more of the reality of Gaza, that we already know more than the majority of probably 95% of Israelis, because they're not getting information about the war on their news feeds like we are. So there's a huge effort on that. We worked with Representative McGovern on a letter that was signed by close to 70 House Democrats, saying that we need foreign journalists into Gaza. That's going to be so critical. And we also want to support. We just hosted Haggai Matar, the head of 972 magazine. This is an Israeli magazine that's reporting on the occupation that's happening in Gaza. And they're worried that they're actually going to be sanctioned out of existence, and all of their Israeli staff are going to have to go into exile. I did offer him my couch if he needed it. But seriously, this is a really important institution reporting. They reported on the lavender issue, the AI that the Israeli government's using to do their targeting in Gaza. And they are exposing these stories. Haaretz is also under attack. They've been put on the sanctions list. So a lot of work to do, and that's a good point you bring up, John.
No, sorry, just about Hassan El-Tayyab, thank you for everything, and inspiring work. I was actually kind of curious. Yeah, sure. I was saying thanks to Hassan first and foremost, but I was going to ask you to expand on your February trip, but I think you just may have just, unless you have other thoughts to share in terms of how you're, maybe I'll ask the feeling, how you're feeling going back, what are you looking forward to, and maybe what's the biggest challenge as
Yeah.
you return?
Thank you for that. So I'm feeling excited and trepidatious. I'm feeling excited because I have a lot of friends out there that I love seeing, including the headmaster of the Ramallah Friends School. Our families are both from Madaba, Jordan. So we like to, we like to let Palestinians know that, and Jordanians, while we might not be better cooks, our mensep is pretty solid. So I'm trepidatious about getting through the airport. My name kind of makes me stick out a little bit there. If you may have guessed, but they detained me and held me for 8 hours the first time I went in 2022, and they questioned me for about 2 hours of that. They took my phone. It was just a really hostile and aggressive experience. This part was actually kind of funny. They had my phone in one of the Israeli security guards. They had my phone, and all of a sudden my friend Kayvon texted me at that same moment while the phone was in her hand, and it said, Hassan, what's the status of the Gaza bill? So she was like, who's Kayvon and what is this Gaza bill? and so I had to sit there at the Israeli airport as I'm trying to get through security to explain why I support UNRWA funding. And a GAO report on the Israel blockade of Gaza. But so that experience, and I know it's a much more tense situation, so I'm nervous about that. I'm excited to work with the Carter Center again, excited to meet these Israeli-Palestinian veterans. The most I'm excited about is to be with the Ramallah Friends School students. That to me is, warms my heart, and I always learn so much from them, and they inspire me to keep going. So that's really how I'm feeling about the trip. Thanks for asking.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a question. I have a question here.
Yeah.
Recently, the New York Times did not publish one full-page ad from the Friend, and this was about Gaza.
Mhm.
Why did they do that? And what is your approach towards making sure that people are aware of if a prominent American newspaper doesn't put it out, what is your way of doing it? I have another question.
Mhm.
I've noticed that FCNL is working very hard, but there are other people also working. The Pope has made a statement about Gaza. There are other interfaith organizations also involved. How are you coordinating this effort?
Two great questions. So one, I think the New York Times is also, they're not wanting to push a narrative that there's a genocide occurring. I'm assuming, I don't know, I'm not in the newsroom, I'm not in the editorial room, so I don't have direct knowledge, but I think there's probably forces inside the New York Times and other, US media outlets where, they have a particular narrative that they're, hoping to get out there, and putting an ad, in the New York Times, like a full page ad would undercut a narrative that they're trying to perpetuate. On who we're working with, I'm glad you asked that question, because we've been doing, I think this is probably like the best work that we have been doing as the FCNL Middle East team, is we've been chairing the US Ceasefire Coalition call. So every week we do a call with about 80 or so groups on board, Jewish, Muslim, Christian groups, anti-war, veteran, humanitarian, human rights, really a lot of these DC NGOs. And we're trying to, my colleague Odelia and I don't know if you folks know Odelia, but She's my program assistant at FCNL this year. She's from Israel. She moved here because I asked her to. And she's been working with us. So the two of us actually have been coordinating a lot of these activities. And so we want to keep that going and even grow the coalition to make sure that we're getting even more groups. Can we get the Black Lives Matter folks involved in a deeper way? NAACP, can we get labor involved? Some of that's been going on, but that's what I'm hoping for, is to expand the coalition even further. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to give my time to Dot on the online, since there hasn't been much. Is that possible, John? I was gonna ask about the legislative influence of the international court system. That's for another day.
Limited. Yeah. Yeah, if someone wants to unmute on Zoom and ask a question, please.
Hi, Hassan. Dat Dusen from online from Frederick. Good to see you again, and good to listen to you, and your message is powerful and most welcome. I don't really have any questions. I just have admiration for the work that you do and that FCNL does, and will be very eager to be part of it as part of the advocacy teams, and call on Muslims and Jews and other friends to join us. So that's my point.
That I'm grateful for you, brother,
Okay,
and looking forward to continuing.
thank you.
Tell me.
Yeah, I was a little bit curious as to like how you deal with like a hostile government. I know that the settlements in the West Bank are some of the most subsidized housing in the entirety of Israel. And sort of Ben Gvir as well, like went to Dome of the Rock during Ramadan, I believe, like protested being there. And it only seems like Israel's government keeps getting more and more like right wing, like it's the most right wing government in Israel's history. So like, how do you deal with the government that may go against the will of the general Israeli people, but still very entrenched, only seems to be getting more and more hostile towards Palestinian people?
Yeah. Over the holiday break, I read a really good book. Yeah, well, I read actually two, but Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet by Thich Nhat Hanh. I needed some inspiration because we are up against incredible odds that may not be resolved in our lifetime. We just know that. Things are getting, unfortunately, worse, and they're likely to continue to get worse before they get better. But I do believe that, there's a horizon here, and there are things that we can still do. So when how do we deal with it? I mean, we have to keep putting one foot in front of the other. We have to maintain our own sanity, maintain like what he's advocating in that book is that we all, become bodhisattvas, which is, people on the path to enlightenment. And we do that by embracing our inner meditator, our inner artist, and our inner warrior. So I don't know. I'm trying to, maintain that centeredness as we proceed because, that's what's going to inspire others to keep going. If we, just kind of let despair just, capture us, then we're not going to be as effective as we could be. We also need to find out where the opportunities are. Now that Biden is no longer the president, and Trump is in there, we're going to see maybe more lanes open on the Democratic side, and maybe even a few lanes on the Republican side that we didn't have before, like the example I mentioned on Yemen, where that was also a hostile government. We were able to stop mid-air refueling, which opened up a ton of space for diplomacy and literally saved 250,000 lives. This was the dictator who murdered Jamal Khashoggi, who starved Yemen. And so there have been other situations that we need to look to inspiration and keep making these parallels, that we're just holding the Israeli government to the same standards as we are these other countries. And last thing I'll say is that we know that advocacy is just one piece of the puzzle. it's an important piece, but there's other work that needs to be done on the electoral front. Actually, this is not an FCNL lane. We're not doing this, but I'm grateful that groups like A New Policy have just sprung up, and they're trying to actually raise money on the PAC side and kind of get involved in some of that work because we need to, increase the power of the peace movement on Capitol Hill, and I think that's a key piece of it. And that institution was created by some former Biden admin officials, including Josh Paul, Tariq Abash, and others. So,
The United States has asked Israel to cease fire. Well, why don't we cease fire? Stop sending the arms.
well said. I love lobbying with this guy. He cuts. I'm like, I'm just kind of. I get my, the jargon giraffe gets thrown up while I'm talking quite a bit, but he cuts right to it. We lobbied Van Hollen together. We lobbied Representative Raskin, and some great meetings. Go ahead.
Really proud of you. There is a great movement throughout the West Bank of civil society. And I put up some examples over here. We don't hear about these folks very much. We know about some of the Quaker organizations, but there's others that it's worth paying attention to. There's not just this war business going on. There's some people doing good educational community action kind of things, both within the camps and some of the city areas as well in the villages. So keep that in mind. That isn't just us over here running our thumbs and supporting this gentleman right here, but there are people over there. So they're working on their end to try to do well. So yeah, and buy some of this olive oil too.
Michael, that's such a great point. And I'm assuming part of that you're talking about is the unarmed civilian protection that's going on. And if you don't know about this, there are several groups, many groups, on the ground in the West Bank doing what they call UCP, or unarmed civilian protection. And what they're trying to do is de-escalate a lot of settler violence and things. And we're trying to help a few folks at Nonviolent Peace Force to get a deployment of 100 visas for internationals to go do trainings on UCP and try to get a security for these folks as they do this work. And I've been working with some of these folks, combatants does it, physicians for human rights, rabbis for human rights, I should say. And it's just so inspiring that people are going, making relationships with the Palestinians, with the settlers, with the IDF, and then actually able to save lives on the ground by going in, using their words, not physical force, to actually de-escalate and prevent some worst case scenarios. So we need to support all of these methodologies. I saw someone pointing at the Zoom screen here. Okay.
Thank you. I'm sure many of you know that Michael's daughter lives in Amman, Jordan, and has been working for Save the Children for years and is now switching over to CARE next week for her main country is Syria. Over Christmas, we had a chance to visit with her. And she took the job with Save over in Amman October 1st last year, a week before the October 7th bombing. And at that point, we were recognizing all of these were our bombs. So over Christmas this year, we were recognizing that our country, is responsible for genocide. And our country and our children, and I'm sorry, Xander, that we're leaving this with your generation. We are going to be living in the same place that Germany is now. 75 years later, we might be able to turn the tide again. But we have lost, I mean, our country has turned our role in this world around. And this, I mean, we've been doing it systematically over time since World War II. And now we've kind of like nailed it. If you want to use it as a goal we would never have wanted to do. So I bring it back to FCNL. You guys have led us in lots and lots of things. War is not the answer, but I sure like to say, or see FCNL say, what is the answer? And lead us through our grief and rebuilding after we turn this thing around.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And that resonates. Appreciate your daughter's good work. And if she wants to grab Mensa, I can send her to my aunt's house. I'd be happy to. Ahlan wa sahlan, as we say, welcome. And as far as the way forward, I think that's a really good point. That's part of the reason why we're working so hard to restore UNRWA funding, because this is an institution that's dedicated to Palestinian refugees, you know, and that refugee status, because we think, you know, Palestinians should be able to go home someday. And that's what we're trying to preserve the space for. And we know that a ceasefire is step one. You know, it's not, you know, this is just one piece in a long road to recovery and rebuilding. So I'm totally with you, and we want to work together to find these solutions. We follow the lead of groups like PalThink and other Palestinian voices who are thinking more about, okay, well, what kind of structures do we need to have in place and institutions do we need to have in place to make sure that Palestinian society in Gaza can actually function? You know, we were working on a new agreement for movement and access that FCNL, you know, put together. I drafted, where we were hoping to try to build on the agreement of movement and access in 2005, and use that as a way to make sure that there can be access in Gaza and that we have actual consistency with what gets into the Strip and evacuation. So we have been thinking about this, but right now we're very focused on the weapons, ceasefire, and humanitarian access because the need is just so pressing.
Maybe this will be the next question.
What about BDS? Is the FCNL acting on behalf of divesting?
So FCNL hasn't, and you know, Hassan the person and Hassan the FCNL staff member, sometimes we're two different people. FCNL has not taken a formal position on BDS, but we are anti-BDS. That makes sense. We want to make sure that Americans have the right to boycott regardless. It's a huge tool of advocacy, and we want to make sure that's preserved. But I will say that things that we are lobbying on, like blocking offensive weapon sales to Israel, like the JDAMs, the tank munitions, the artillery shells, that to us is a piece of that, making sure that we're not sending these weapons. But we haven't really weighed in on like boycotting certain you know, U.S. institutions or U.S. companies like Starbucks and others for their actions. You know, I haven't gone to a Starbucks in quite a while. And it's a conversation that I think should be opened up again, to be honest. I think a lot of this, you know, is, I think Quakers weighing in, you know, through the FCNL process as board members have the power to influence the direction way more than me as their lobbyists.
So my question is about the daily life of people in Palestine. You know, I read about people starving and you know, children freezing and so forth. Can you give kind of just a general assessment, like how many people had access to heat or electricity or anywhere near adequate amount of food? Maybe you kind of paint a picture so I can
Mhm.
see that.
I mean, it's unbearable to think, you know, you've got a majority of the population that doesn't have electricity, doesn't have enough food, doesn't have enough water. You've got rampant malnutrition. You know, this is the worst place in the world to be a child right now. 7 children, again, died of hypothermia. You've got, you know, children washing away into the Mediterranean Sea because their tents are literally right on the beach. So, I mean, it's unbearable. I could go into a lot more detail, but you know, I don't think I could even describe it. We have been one thing, so I don't want to say things that I don't have firsthand knowledge of, but I've been doing a lot of lobbying with American doctors that got back from Gaza, and maybe that can kind of give you a sense of sort of their experience and how it can relate to everything. So one, when these doctors are trying to get in, they're not allowed to bring in supplies, you know, except for one small bag. They do their work in a local medical facility or hospital, and then they're literally followed back to. They take off their scrubs because as a doctor, you know, you're going to get followed by quadcopters and other drones that are armed with weapons. And these are two-way communications going on, so you can actually speak to the drones as they're flying right next to you with a machine gun pointed at you. And you know, on the other end will be like probably an 18-year-old Israeli who's shouting commands at you, take a step to your left or you're going to get shot. You know, take a step to your right, this kind of thing. And then the quadcopters fly into the homes of Palestinians and these doctors, take a bunch of pictures while they're just sitting there in their living room, and then they fly out. I mean, it is so dystopian. Literally, drones are buzzing 24/7. So it's and a lot of Palestinians are saying like it's like they're trying to make us insane. And that's the thing that's just like, I just can't even imagine like the grinding away of these drones and feeling like completely surveilled. There's also just the people of Gaza are some of the most resilient and brilliant people. They're you know, just what they've been able to, you know, how they've been able to stay even somewhat hopeful, you know, and it's just beyond me. I just don't know how they're so strong. And again, I probably leave it there, but it's just absolutely horrific conditions, and that's why we're pushing for the ceasefire and humanitarian access because it's unlivable. And it was unlivable before the war. That's another thing that people need to understand is that this was not, you know, a place that was conducive for a thriving existence before the war, where you had 80% of the population, you know, needing food assistance for survival.
Thank you very much, Hassan. I think this has been a very helpful conversation. Thank you. And we're looking forward to ways to work with you and FCNL.
Thanks for watching our video. For more content from Sandy Spring Friends Meeting, click to subscribe.